The sky over the prairie darkened without warning, as if a great hand had drawn a curtain across the sun. What had been a quiet afternoon thick with heat turned sharp and restless. Wind tore through the grass, flattening it in rolling waves, carrying the metallic scent of rain long before the first drop fell. Ezekiel Carter stood at the hog pen, tall and broad as the fence posts he had driven into the ground with his own hands. Sweat clung to his skin, his shirt darkened across the shoulders, his jaw set in the way it always was when the land tested him. He lifted his eyes to the horizon, just as lightning split the clouds, a jagged white scar across the sky. "Storm's coming," he muttered. Behind him, the hog squealed, high, sharp, panicked. The sound cut straight through him. The first rain hit hard. Fat drops struck the dirt and burst into mud, then came faster, heavier, until the ground itself seemed to soften and give way. Water rushed downhill toward the pen, pooling at the low edges where the boards had warped with age. Ezekiel swore under his breath and moved fast. He hauled at a loose plank along the base of the pen, boots sinking deep into the muck as runoff poured in. The hog thrashed, its cries climbing louder as cold water lapped at its legs. "This won't hold," he shouted, though no one but the wind answered. He shoved his shoulder against the board, his muscles burned, veins standing thick along his forearms. The plank shifted an inch, then slid back as another surge of water forced its way through. The storm roared, thunder cracking close enough to rattle his bones. Then the mud splashed again. Another set of footsteps entered the pen. Ezekiel turned, rain stinging his eyes, and saw Selah wading toward him. Her skirt was soaked through, clinging heavy to her legs, her shawl long since lost to the wind. Dark hair had come loose from its careful tie, whipping around her face. Yet her expression was steady, focused, unafraid. "What are you doing?" he barked. "Helping," she answered simply. She braced herself on the opposite side of the beam, planting her feet as firmly as the sucking muck allowed. Her hands closed around the slick wood, knuckles whitening as she leaned in with her full weight. "On three," she said, raising her voice over the storm. "1, 2, now!" They pushed together. Ezekiel felt the difference at once, not just added strength, but balance. The plank groaned, wood protesting as it shifted higher. Water sprayed sideways, cold and biting, but the gap narrowed. With one final shove, the beam wedged tight into place. The rush slowed. Inside the pen, the hog scrambled toward a drier corner, its squeals fading into low, uncertain grunts. The worst of the flood diverted away instead of through. They staggered back, chests heaving, rain still pounding down around them. Mud streaked Selah's cheek, wet hair clung to her temple. For a moment she only stared at the pen, as if not quite believing it held. Then she laughed. It burst from her chest, bright and sudden, cutting clean through the thunder. "Look at us, two fools fighting the sky to save a hog." The sound struck Ezekiel harder than the storm. He had known anger, strain, exhaustion, but laughter like that, born in the middle of hardship, was something else entirely. Without meaning to, his mouth curved into a rough, unfamiliar smile. The rain kept falling, but slower now. They stayed, scraping muck from the corners, hauling in dry straw from the shed. Every movement brought them close, shoulder brushing shoulder, hands colliding on wet timber. Each touch lingered a fraction longer than the last, neither of them quite pulling away. By the time the storm thinned to a steady drizzle, both were soaked through and shaking with fatigue. They sank onto the porch steps side by side, breath fogging the damp air. Neither moved away. Selah tilted her face toward the sky, where a pale break in the clouds let through a sliver of light. "Even in storms, there's ground to stand on," she said softly. Ezekiel followed her gaze upward, but only briefly. His eyes drifted back to her face, to the calm strength in her expression, to the way rain traced slow paths down her dark skin. For one dangerous instant, something stirred in his chest that had nothing to do with land or wills or hogs. He rose abruptly, breaking the moment, and held out his hand. "Come inside," he said, voice rough but steady. "You'll catch cold." She studied his hand, broad, scarred, still streaked with mud. Then she placed hers in his. Her grip was firm, grounded. As he pulled her to her feet, their hands stayed joined a second longer than necessary, not clinging, just unwilling to rush apart. They stepped into the cabin together, leaving behind the dripping pen and the retreating storm. Outside, the rain eased into quiet taps against the roof. Inside, something else had shifted, something neither of them yet named, but both had felt. The storm had passed, and it had left its mark.
The fever came quietly, slipping in after the storm as though it had been waiting its turn. At first, Ezekiel Carter felt only the weight of exhaustion. His muscles ached deep from hauling timber and fighting floodwater, his joints stiff as he lay back on the narrow bed. The cabin was warm from the fire Sila had stoked high, the scent of damp earth and smoke lingering thick in the air. He told himself rest would set him right by morning. By midnight, rest had abandoned him. Heat burned beneath his skin, sharp and relentless. Sweat soaked through his shirt and bedding alike, though his teeth began to chatter as if winter had crept in unseen. When he tried to sit up, the room tilted hard, walls sliding out of place. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, always intending, to rise, to tend the hog, to keep his end of things steady. His strength failed him. Ezekiel collapsed to the floor with a heavy thud, breath knocked clean from his chest. The sound tore through the cabin. Sila awoke at once, heart leaping into her throat. She hurried from the small adjoining room and found him sprawled on the floor, broad shoulders heaving, skin flushed dark beneath the lamplight. For a heartbeat she froze, fear hollowing her chest. This was the man who split logs before dawn, who stood against storms and heat alike. Now he lay undone, fever-struck and helpless. Then fear gave way to motion. She knelt beside him, slid an arm beneath his shoulders, and with more strength than she knew she possessed, dragged him back onto the bed. His skin burned beneath her hands. His breath came thick and uneven. "Ezekiel," she whispered, though she knew he could barely hear. She moved quickly after that. Water from the well, cloth soaked and wrung, fire stoked higher to keep the chill from settling too deep. She pressed cool fabric to his brow, changed it when it warmed, then changed it again. Outside, the hog squealed. Duty did not pause for sickness. Before dawn, Sila wrapped her shawl tight and stepped back into the wet yard. Mud clung heavy to her skirts as she carried feed to the pen. The hog greeted her with hungry grunts, alive and demanding. She filled the trough, her arms trembling with fatigue, and stood there a moment longer than necessary, watching it eat. At least one life was steady. Inside, Ezekiel muttered in broken fragments, words that made no sense. His hands clenched at the sheets, as if grasping for something just beyond reach. Each time Sila pressed a cloth to his face, she felt the heat radiating fierce and unyielding. "You stubborn man," she murmured, more plea than scold. "You'd rather break than ask." Her fingers brushed his cheek, rough with stubble. The sensation startled her. She did not pull away. Instead, she let her palm rest there, grounding herself as much as him. Sometime near dawn, his eyes cracked open. They were clouded, unfocused, but they found her shape at the bedside. His lips moved. No sound came, but she knew the shape of her own name when she saw it. Her chest tightened. By the second day, the fever still held. Sila moved between pen and bedside like a tethered thing, worn thin but unyielding. She changed cloths, coaxed water between his lips, spoke softly even when her voice shook. When night fell again, exhaustion finally dragged at her own limbs. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand still wrapped around his, and leaned back against the frame. "I must not stop," she whispered to herself. "If I do, we lose everything." But she did not mean the land, not the hog. She meant him. Morning light crept in, pale and unsure. The fire had burned low. The cabin smelled of smoke, sweat, and damp wood. Ezekiel stirred, a deep breath dragging into his chest as though he had surfaced from dark water. The fever had broken. He blinked, mind clearing slowly, and the first thing he saw was Sila slumped beside the bed, her hair fallen loose around her face. Her hand was clasped in his so tightly her fingers had left pale marks on his skin. He lay still, watching her. She looked smaller like this, worn with care and wakefulness, yet stronger than he had ever known her to be. In that quiet moment, something inside him shifted. The weight he had always carried alone, anger, pride, stubborn resolve, felt suddenly misplaced. He turned his hand gently, brushing his thumb against the back of hers. Silas startled awake, eyes wide for a breath, before recognition softened them. "You're awake," she breathed, relief flooding her voice. He nodded once, his throat tightened, the words scraping their way out rough and bare. "Thank you." Only 2 words, but they carried everything he did not know how to say. She did not answer with words. She only squeezed his hand, steady and sure, as if sealing something unspoken between them. Later that day, Ezekiel forced himself outside. The hog stood healthy in its pen, trough full, straw laid clean. Everything had been kept. When he turned back, Sila stood in the doorway watching him, her shoulders weary, her expression quiet with pride. And for the first time, Ezekiel understood the truth beneath the trial. This was no longer something he carried alone. Something fragile and real had taken hold between them, born not of will or obligation, but of endurance freely given. And neither of them would be the same again.
Evening settled over the prairie, slow and heavy, the kind that carried warmth long after the sun dipped low. The storm's wreckage had dried into crusted earth, and the hog in its pen had grown quiet, its breathing deep and steady. Inside the cabin, lamplight glowed soft and amber, pushing back the dark that gathered at the windows. Ezekiel Carter sat at the rough wooden table, a ledger open before him, though he had not turned a page in some time. His thoughts moved slower than his hand ever had, circling one truth he could no longer ignore. Across from him, Scylla mended a tear in a sleeve, her fingers nimble, practiced. The small sounds of thread pulling through cloth filled the space between them. Silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like waiting. Ezekiel cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet. "You kept this place standing while I lay flat," he said at last. "I owe you more than I can put to words." Scylla lifted her eyes to him, surprise flickering there before settling into calm. "You don't owe me," she replied evenly. "If I'd let go, we'd both have lost. I don't leave things half done." The fire cracked, sending a brief flare of light across her face. In that glow, Ezekiel saw not the widow the town whispered about, nor the woman bound to him by a strange will, but an equal, steady, resilient, and unafraid to stand her ground. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I've spent my life working, breaking land, breaking myself. I never thought I'd be good at being anyone's husband." Scylla set the cloth aside. Her hands rested still in her lap. "Do you think I wanted perfection? I had a husband once. He was kind, but he leaned on me for everything. When he died, the town looked at me with pity, like I was something that needed saving." Her voice did not shake, but the weight behind it pressed heavy. "I don't want to be saved. I want to be seen, to carry alongside, not behind." Ezekiel cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet. In their words, he heard the echo of his own solitude. Slowly, he reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. She did not pull away. The touch was simple, unadorned, yet it sent a quiet shock through them both. Her palm was warm, calloused in places, familiar now from weeks of shared labor. His grip was careful, restrained, as though he feared breaking something fragile. The cabin stilled.
Ezekiel lifted his other hand, hesitated, then brushed his fingers along her cheek. Her skin was warm beneath his touch. His voice dropped, roughened by restraint. "Once I touch you," he said, each word measured, "there's no turning back." Scylla's breath caught. For a moment uncertainty flickered in her dark eyes, fear of loss, of hope, of trusting again. Then she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his chest, the steady beat of his heart loud beneath her ear. "Then let it happen," she breathed. The words loosened something deep in him. Ezekiel bent his head, pressing his lips to hers, gentle at first, almost questioning. She answered without hesitation, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, grounding herself there. The kiss deepened, no longer cautious, no longer held back by doubt. When they parted, their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling. The moment stretched, heavy and certain. They moved toward the bed without words. Clothes were shed not in haste, but with a careful reverence, as if each touch was a promise rather than a demand. Ezekiel discovered a patience he had never known, guiding rather than taking, listening to the soft sounds she made, as though they were instructions he meant to honor. Scylla discovered something just as profound. In his touch there was no claim of ownership, no hunger to prove himself, only presence, only care. The old wooden bed creaked softly beneath them as they came together, their bodies finding a rhythm that felt less like conquest and more like homecoming. Outside, the night wind whispered through the rails, and the hog stirred once before settling again. Later, when the fire burned low and the world narrowed to breath and warmth, Scylla lay with her head on Ezekiel's chest, his arm resting around her, broad and sure, his hand moving slow and absent-minded through her hair. "If I lose the land," he murmured into the quiet, "I won't regret this." She shifted, lifting her gaze to his. In the dim light, her eyes shone bright with something that looked like peace. "Neither will I," she said softly. They lay in silence after that, listening to the sounds of the night and the steady drum of his heart. What had begun as a trial of endurance had crossed into something else entirely, something chosen, not enforced. Outside, the hog grunted low in its pen, a steady living reminder of all that bound them together. Inside, two lives had turned onto a path neither could step away from. There was no turning back, and for the first time, neither of them wanted to.
Summer settled over the prairie like a relentless hand. The sun rose hard and unforgiving, bleaching the grass to a brittle gray and cracking the earth beneath it. By midday, the air itself seemed to burn, thick with heat and the sour tang of livestock. Even the wind felt tired, dragging itself across the land without relief. In the hog pen, the animal no longer charged the trough with the hunger of spring. It lay instead in the shade, sides heaving, eyes dull. Ezekiel Carter worried himself thin over it. He skipped meals, hauled bucket after bucket of cool water from the well, and poured it slow across the hog's back, watching steam rise as if the heat were boiling straight out of the ground. "Stay with me," he muttered, rubbing its flank. "Just stay." Scylla watched from the porch, one hand resting unconsciously over her rounding belly. The child within her shifted often now, a quiet reminder of life pressing forward, even as the world seemed determined to grind them down. The heat left her breathless. Nausea came and went without warning, stealing what little strength she had. One afternoon, while tending the garden, the sun pressed too hard, the world tilted, edges blurring. Scylla sank to the ground between the rows of beans, palms braced against the dirt as she fought for air. Ezekiel was at her side in seconds, lifting her with arms that shook from more than effort. "Don't push yourself," he said, fear threading his voice. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the lie tasted bitter. "Just dizzy." He held her until the tremor eased, then guided her back to the cabin, his hand firm at her elbow as if afraid she might slip away. Hardship bred whispers. In town, eyes followed Sila when she came for salt or soap, voices lowered just enough to be heard. They spoke of the marriage as scheme and convenience, of her skin and her place, of Ezekiel's temper and ambition. They said she had trapped him with a child. They said he had taken her only for land. The words cut deep. Sila carried them home with her, stacked atop the weight of heat and sickness and worry. She did not speak of them. She set her bundles down and returned to her tasks, quieter than before. That night, while Ezekiel labored under the lantern light repairing the pen roof, Sila sat at the kitchen table. Candlelight flickered over a blank page. Her hand trembled as she dipped the pen. Living together has become too difficult. The words came slow, each one tearing at her chest. She wrote of health, of dignity, of a trial that pressed too hard. Tears fell, blurring the ink. Her vision swam. Through the open door she saw Ezekiel's silhouette outside, dent beneath the lantern glow, sweat carving dark paths down his back as he lifted plank after plank. He did not curse, he did not pause. He worked as though holding the roof together meant holding everything together. Her chest tightened. Sila folded the paper before the sentence was finished and pushed it deep into the drawer. By morning, Ezekiel reached into that same drawer for his knife. His fingers brushed the folded page. He opened it, read just enough to understand, then closed it again. His jaw set, not in anger, but resolve. He placed the paper back where it was and went outside without a word. That day he worked harder than she had ever seen. He built a new awning over the hog pen, dug trenches to carry water away, hauled stone to brace the fence. The sun baked his skin dark, sweat soaked him through, yet he did not slow. Sila stood in the doorway watching, shame and tenderness twisting tight together in her chest. She knew he had read the letter. She knew he chose silence, not to punish her, but to endure. When evening fell, Ezekiel stumbled back toward the cabin, exhaustion heavy in his stride. Without speaking, Sila carried a basin of water to him. She knelt and washed the grime from his hands, her fingers gentle around the scars etched into his skin. He looked down at her, his eyes weary but warm. No words passed. None were needed. The heat lingered through August. The hog wavered, then slowly recovered under their care. Sila set the complaint aside, and Ezekiel answered hurt, with quiet patience. In that season of strain, something stronger than obligation bound them. By late summer, Ezekiel understood a truth he could no longer avoid. If they let weariness rule them, everything would unravel. One evening, he brought the ledger to the table and wrote carefully across a clean page, "Household rules." Sila looked up, surprised. He spoke plainly. They would divide labor clearly, keep a common purse, speak grievances before they festered, and then he wrote one final line, the 48-hour rule. "If either of us feels like quitting," he said, meeting her eyes, "we wait 2 days. We try to fix it first." Silas studied the words, then nodded. That sounds like law. From that night on, the rules lived beyond ink. They laughed when Ezekiel ruined porridge. They sat together each week with the ledger open, teasing and counting, sharing burdens that once would have been borne alone. The hog grew strong again. By the time autumn winds cooled the land, the pen stood solid, the animal broad and glossy with health. Sila, heavy with child, stood beside Ezekiel at the fence, her hand resting on her belly, his hand resting lightly over hers. They did not speak. They did not need to. What nearly broke them had instead shaped them, patience carved by heat, trust forged in silence, and a bond chosen daily, even when the world pressed hardest. The letter remained in the drawer, forgotten and undone. And so was the complaint.
Autumn came quietly, slipping over the prairie on cool winds that carried the scent of dry leaves and distant rain. The land, once cracked and exhausted by summer's fury, breathed again. Grass bent green at its roots. The hog in the pen stood broad and glossy now, its grunts deep and steady, no longer the fragile sound of survival, but the confident voice of health. Inside the cabin, life moved to a new rhythm.
The baby arrived on a night thick with fear and fire. Labor wrung Scylla hard, her cries tearing through the small room like lightning through sky. Ezekiel had never known terror like it. He stood at her side, his massive frame useless against the pain gripping her, yet he did not let go. His hand wrapped around hers, steady as iron, his voice low and unbreaking. "I'm here," he told her again and again. "I won't leave you." When the child's cry finally split the air, strong, furious, alive, Ezekiel's knees nearly gave way. A son, small and red-faced, lungs full of will. When Scylla took the child to her chest, exhaustion and wonder mingling in her eyes, something final and unshakable settled into place. This was no trial anymore. This was a family. Weeks passed. The nights shortened. The baby slept longer. The cabin filled with soft sounds, breath, fire crackle, the quiet creak of the cradle Ezekiel had built with his own hands. Scylla moved slower now, her body still healing, but her eyes carried a calm she had never known before. Ezekiel worked with a different kind of strength, no longer driven by anger or fear, but a certainty rooted deep in his bones. 9 months had come and gone. One crisp morning, a black-painted carriage rattled into the yard, its polished sides catching the autumn light. Ezekiel straightened from the pen, wiping his hands on his trousers. Scylla stepped onto the porch with the baby in her arms, the child's small fingers curling around her shawl. The lawyer, Whitmore, dismounted with practiced care. He removed his hat, his expression measured, respectful. Inside the cabin, he laid the papers upon the same table that had seen arguments, laughter, and the careful scratching of rules meant to keep two people from breaking apart. He read slowly. "You have lived together for the required 9 months. No formal complaint has been filed. The hog remains alive and in good health." His gaze lifted. "The conditions of the will have been met." Relief washed through Ezekiel, not sharp or triumphant, but quiet and heavy, like a long-held breath finally released. Scylla closed her eyes for a moment, her lips curving into a small, steady smile. The ranch was theirs. Yet when the lawyer slid another page forward, the air shifted. "There is an additional clause," he said evenly. "If within 3 years the ranch is maintained in good standing, productive, stable, the northern tract will also pass to you." 3 years. The land to the north stretched wide and untamed, a promise and a challenge both. Ezekiel felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders, familiar, yet different now. After the lawyer left, they sat together on the porch. The hog rooted contentedly in its pen. The baby slept warm against Scylla's chest. The prairie rolled out before them, vast and open. "What do you think we could plant there?" Scylla asked softly. Ezekiel considered the horizon. "Corn? Apples? Maybe horses? Maybe a small school someday," she added, almost shyly, "for children who can't travel far." He looked at her then, not surprised, only proud. "You always see further than I do." That night, under a young moon, Ezekiel leaned against the fence rail alone for a moment, the cool air filling his lungs. He thought back to the day he had signed the will, anger burning hot in his chest, convinced he was being mocked by fate itself. He had never imagined this ending. From the cabin window, Scylla watched him, her silhouette soft in lamplight, the baby stirring gently in her arms. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be droughts, arguments, losses yet to seen. But she also knew this. What had been forged between them, through storm, sickness, heat, restraint, and choice, could not be undone by hardship or time. Ezekiel turned back toward the cabin. When he stepped inside, Scylla met his eyes. No words passed between them. They did not need to. The trial was over. The legacy had just begun.